Thank you, Charles. Our next presenter is Laurie Olin, partner at Olin, the landscape architecture firm that has worked on projects such as the AIA award-winning Barnes Foundation in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. His presentation is titled Rural Effect and Domestic Seclusion, Residential Design, Suburban Development, and the Practice of the Olmsted Firm. Please welcome Laurie Olin.
Charles, I think coffee was a great idea, but I'm going to deny you it for now. I'm going to see if I can get through this whole thing. First, I want to thank Gina and the trustees here for this wonderful conference and this wonderful place. It's great to be invited, and it's nice to see all of you. Well, I'm going to start, like most people, I first, as Charles implied, I learned about Olmsted about parks. And like everybody, I had to get through and past that pasteboard idea of this grandfatherly figure who just did parks. Turns out that there was a lot more to it. And I think we need to move, as many people have done in this conference, on to other things. I became interested in, when I was asked to talk about residential, I thought, aha, this is a chance to talk about something else. First, oh, wrong. Yeah, I got to learn how this thing. First, it's been said, but I'll say it again. Olmsted was a reformer in an age of reformers, and these are his contemporaries. These are people he knew, he edited, he read, he hung out with, and he was aware of their work. Look at who's in this list. You start in the top. The Emerson family. There's Ralph Waldo. Then there's A.J. Downing. Lincoln, who he wrote letters to and tried to give some steerage. There's Walt Whitman. There's Frederick Douglass. There's H.H. Richardson, next row. Karl Marx, Friedrich Engels, people who are trying to figure out how to do something about cities. There's this dour-looking person from Scotland, Carlyle. Next to him is Charles Darwin. Down in the lower corner, a person who he published his work at Putnam's, and he did some editing of him, Henry David Thoreau. Next to him, John Muir. Then we have Horace Greeley, who, argued for the park that Olmsted did. There's Margaret Fuller, feminist. There's Charles Dickens, who came and read aloud, and his work was very much about the different classes of life. And then we have, of course, Harriet Beecher Stowe. So Olmsted was one of many people trying to figure out what to do about change in our society at a time, and he chose certain ways to go. He was drawn to New York City, and of course when we think about New York at that time, and we think about cities at that time, they were kind of dirty, ugly, noisy, scary places, dangerous workplaces, growing like topsy, and there was a sense of chaos and a sense of worry and concern on the part of intellectuals and people who are sensitive around the world, certainly in the Western Europe and in America. So how could a person at his young age produce this radical piece of work in make this proposal in 1857? I mean, where did this come from? How did he do this? Well, we've heard about his other career, his travels, and his going to China, going to this place, going to Europe. But I think there's a couple of things that we don't really take seriously. People go over them real fast in the litany about his history, but I don't think people focus on his experience in the Civil War or in his travels in England. I mean, try and imagine what he experienced as having taken on the Sanitary Commission. This was a horrific war. I mean, in 3 years of fighting, 650,000 men were killed. 100,000 more were wounded. At the Battle of Gettysburg, which took 3 days, as many people were killed in 3 days as in the Vietnam War. I mean, imagine that. The Battle of Vicksburg, 35,000. Battle of Gettysburg, 51,000, 53,000 rather. So it was a horrific experience, and it really had a terrible experience. And it was after those last two great battles, Gettysburg and Vicksburg, that he fled to the West Coast. Took the family there as fast as he could, and did this very unlikely thing of managing a mining company and its development. And of course, it was therapy. Yosemite and the landscape he saw and the breathing of air in California, the mountains of the West was, and of course, he had this enormous nostalgia for the for the Connecticut River Valley, where he grew up north of Hartford, and the landscape of New England. And so it's not a wonder that he thought that landscape was a balm and that it was a soothing thing. And when you look at Central Park, there are absolute things like Bethesda Fountain, which is a direct quote from the New Testament. Remember the fountain of Bethesda where the lame and the sick went to be cured, and there were the 7 gates out of it and all that sort of thing, and Jesus had one of his miracles. So that's the centerpiece of Central Park, is a healing fountain. So Olmsted he's an interesting guy. Well, if you look at his contemporaries, think of Homer, Winslow Homer, who started his career as an illustrator for Harper's. And there in the lower, this is one of the illustrations up above, and the lower sketch is of them carrying wounded from the battlefield. He was out there actually on the battlefield with these people like Olmsted very quickly. The first oil painting Homer ever did, was of this sharpshooter killing Confederate men. Well, they both, I think, I'm not going to say that, it's a fallacy to say what other people think, and we all know that. I don't know what other people think. But after the war, when you look at the potential PTSD they both had, I think you have to look at the paintings of Homer, for example, and the things he did immediately after the war for the next decade are all about rural life, nostalgia for farms, children in nature, and he's looking at African Americans, and they're trying to put their lives back together as free people. And so you see Homer, and then after that, of course, he becomes more of a recluse, and he becomes a bit more sort of mordant, but after about 10 years. But this interest in domesticity and a calm, quiet life afterwards. And of course, if you think back about Olmsted and his early days, up there hanging out at Yale and doing stuff, and one of the things is that he is very interested and close to the Transcendental movement. And of course, he has contemporaries who are painters, people like Church, Cole, Kensett, Trost Richards, that whole batch, who were the Hudson River School. We think of the Luminous. But they were all interested in nature, and quite often there was this vision looking west at sunset over water that we see, the detail from the Mount Katahdin painting by Kensett on the left, and Church's twilight up above in the middle. Olmsted, at age 24, wrote a letter to his friend Kingsbury, and he said that he had been reading Carlyle's Sartor Resartus, a work that actually became a touchstone of the Transcendental movement. And Olmsted, in the letter, said that he was very critical of society, of religion, and of cities. And he was very upset about the impact of Industrial Revolution and that sort of thing. And so he knew the Emerson family personally. And so you have to understand, for him, nature is beautiful. It's powerful. He's not interested in organized religion, but he believes that divinity comes from within and it pervades the whole universe. Well, if we move on and we look at one of his first urban planning projects of 1868, one of the things in Buffalo is, yes, there's a great park of hundreds of acres with a lake of about 46 acres. It's a quite large park, Delaware Park, but it's also an urban design plan, and it has boulevard streets, and then look at those curving streets all around the top up above it. There's a kind of urban garden city suburb goes with this park, and people don't really focus on the city streets and the lots that goes with his streets and his parks. But of course there's precedence for this. In his trip to Europe in 1852, where he spent a couple of months in Britain and then 2 months on the continent, one of the things we see is he goes to Birkenhead. Everybody talks about the park. Who talks about what Olmsted also wrote about, which was something like 30 or 60 acres, I can't remember the number. Look at all the terrace housing around it that, yes, it's wonderful the city fathers built a park, but how did they pay for it? They paid for it with urban development, with housing. And there's the housing, and it was very successful. And Olmsted notices that. He notices the value of it. He notices the interrelationship between the housing and the park and the finance. He'd also been to Bath, of course, where he saw John Wood's speculative projects. He also went to see Edinburgh, which had recently pretty much completed the Newtown plan by the time Olmsted gets there with the parks and the squares. And so he sees a lot of precedents, but one of the precedents that nobody even talks about is that He's in London, and this is all complete. Regent's Park is largely under construction. John Nash's work that started down in the countryside with that little project you see in the lower right, Blair Hamlet, the notion of suburban housing, of something that you'd have this country feel close to town with these detached houses, is something that is very interesting. So if you look at the mall plan that comes down from St. James Mall and comes up through Regent Street, and then it gets up to the Crescent, and then you hit Regent's Park. And what do we have around it? We have terrace housing that is a financial venture of the Crown Properties. And then the really interesting thing is Park Village East and Park Village West along the upper right. And you can see the two photographs I have of Prince in a painting in the upper right. The notion of detached suburban housing along curved streets. These are all precedents that Olmsted has seen. So when he does Riverside, it's not out of, the blue. I mean, he actually knows a lot about new town planning. He'd seen a lot of stuff. And of course, there was another thing. There was Llewellyn Park that was done by A.J. Davis in New Jersey. Olmsted had gone to visit a utopian community at Red Bank in New Jersey, but he also saw Llewellyn Park that was finished by the 1850s. And so Olmsted had seen new kind of ideas of garden cities, near-in suburbs with detached houses on picturesque streets before he did Riverside Park. So we all are dependent upon stuff we know and put together stuff and and quite often we don't talk about some of the things that we're stealing the most from. I don't know a poet or a painter that is not good at that. So Riverside Park, one of the things we see, Riverside Plan, the community, is these curving streets. And the interesting thing about it is the streets are curving not because of topography. This is a pretty flat site. It looks like it's topography. No, they're curving because he wants you to be in the experience of the street and not seeing out and moving within the trees as you come along the streets. He wants to embed you in this landscape. He wrote a lot about housing, and I may find a quote or two here for you. He wrote considerably, as you've heard, and the papers have many different places in his collective papers. There's many places where it's very clear that he's writing about residential stuff. He says, among other things, there need at least be no essential difference in character between a farmer's home and what would be considered a desirable home for an artist, a merchant, or a lawyer, except such as would result from actual necessities of situation. And then he wrote something else. He said, he placed great emphasis upon, and I quote, domesticity, seclusion, and community. And he continued that he was interested in rural effect and domestic seclusion. That's a very interesting phrase, rural effect and domestic seclusion. And he then went on to say, when not engaged in business, the worker has no occasion to be near his working place, but demands arrangements of a wholly different character. Families require to settle in sufficient numbers to support those establishments that administer their social and other wants. And he goes on. He talks about that it's good to get people away from the city. He said if they want to make the most of life, they should have access to good roads and walks and other advantages for exercise and easy, cheerful use of whatever advantages there may be near them for social intercourse. It is equally certain, quote, if they fail to secure fresh air in abundance, pleasant natural scenery, trees, flowers, birds, and in short, the essential advantages of a rural residence, they will possess but a meager share of the reward of providence. Well, that's pretty clear. I would say that he also says that no matter what the character of the distant outlook, however, it's always desirable that the line of division between that which is interior and that which is looked upon from it should be distinct and unmistakable. So the here and there, he's conscious of that. And he says, but whenever there is an open or distant view for a residence, the grounds, construction, and plantations about the house should form a fitting foreground to that view, well-defined, suitably proportioned, salient, elegant, and finished. He truly believes that you can put people into a situation that will be good for their health through design. And at Riverside, one of the things he decided early on in this very first project was that you can't control architecture. You just don't try and have rules for it. What you do is you regulate setbacks, you regulate its dimensions, its overall height. He liked to set a height on it. And then he also said that he believed that properties should be well screened for privacy between each lot, between each house. He recommended dense hedges and heavy planting so that each individual lot had its own sense of privacy. He's very interested in community, but he's also interested in privacy. He thought the two went together, sort of like Tocqueville, that problem of the individual and the group. He felt that was the thing he was always dealing with in these products. Well, in his own house, for instance, Fairstead, when he finally moved up to Brookline at the coaching of H.H. Richardson, one of the things that it's really embedded. It's an internal, it doesn't look out because it has no prospect. So he produces an internal environment that is quite, and of course, here's it overgrown. It couldn't be more cozy. It looks like something Beatrix Potter might have come up with. But the notion, when he could be out in the country at Felsted up in Maine on Deer Island, there's a house he unfortunately didn't get to experience very much for only about a year before he totally declined. But the notion of refuge and prospect, here are the two models of it. You've got them both right here. The long view of nature with the sun setting over the water is the one, or you're buried in verdure on the other hand, the choices you have. Well, in doing urban work, when he got going in New York, if there's the Eastern Parkway on the left, the plan you saw from Charles, and there is an early planting of Ocean Park Boulevard on the right, in about 1902 or so. One of the things is that, or no, that's earlier, that's in the 1890s. But the notion, he felt, well, okay, if we're going to have tight row houses and dense housing, then we have to have ample streets, tree-lined streets, big streets, boulevards, and they must lead in very short distances, proximity to parks. And so here we see Eastern Parkway in Brooklyn being developed. And so the notion of you build this grand street and then people will come dock their houses next to it is sort of like boats. The notion that get the structure right but make it a big, hefty, green, serious structure that takes you to the parks and takes you to places that you want to go on foot quickly. And that's a recent picture I took when my son was living there. Well, when he could, of course, deal with the Manhattan commissioners and argue with them, up on Riverside, he managed to say, not only will you save money, but you'll create value, and the properties looking up and down the river. And he gave them the rhetoric of why, and then figure out how to build this great public promenade with fountains, piazzas, all the means of walking, etc., and as a screen of the industry and the railroads and the docks down below. And so before Riverside Park happened, there was Riverside Drive, and this is a project that it had pedestrian ways, it had bridle trails, it had carriage paths, it had places for overlooks, etc. So just doing a street, but you could step out of the city and have the distant view to the west over the river. Again, this prospect. Well, his interest in domesticity and his interest in communal life led him, when he was working on institutions, to recommend sort of cottages for people to live in, not these barracks that, like at Yale and Harvard, that he'd seen students in. And so when he did Berkeley, he recommended, cottages sort of around a kind of green sward behind Strawberry Creek. And here at the Lawrenceville School in New Jersey, you can see he talks the architect into making a set of cottages that was around a communal green. And then the cottages, he recommended that they have gardens that the students could tend so they would learn about domesticity and they would learn about family life together. So he's very interested in the family, he's very interested in the community, both. And, whoops, what did I do wrong? Try it again. There we go. So here we see another kind of institution. Obviously, there were a lot of different kinds of residences that they worked on. There was the institutional ones, there's the company towns, there's the row houses, there's the estates, etc. But here we see as it says, Columbia Institution for the Deaf and the Dumb in New York. And again, this is a very essential Olmsted landscape in many ways from the father and his vision, because you can see there's the curving paths through verdure. There's these quiet bays and rooms that are off of the central space. The notion of a central space that has off of it subspaces for intimacy and for smaller groups and for calm. The notion of taking people who are under stress of any kind. And then, of course, gardens for them to garden, for the people who live in the institution to be able to actually put their hands in the dirt and become involved with it. So it's a diagram, in a way, of the view of how to do institutional residential gardens. Well, the office by, the 1680s, 70s and 80s was doing a lot of work. They were very busy. They would be brought to towns to do stuff. But a lot of the work they did was for developers, basically. It was for suburban developers. And there's, I think, what did you say, Arlene, 350 of these, something like that. I believe they had over 400 and some in the files, but of those projects, at least 350 of them, we seem to have documents if something got done. Here's a couple that I find rather interesting. One, and they show you a kind of habit of mind of how they go about. After Riverside, it's not exactly a formula, but it's a set of parts that they can use and manipulate. And I think what you're looking at here really is pretty much the work of J.C. Olmsted, working with Dad closely and with some other people. But basically, they're layouts of developments where there's the suburban railroad comes, there's a station, there's a little space, and then you go to a communal, and then it parts and goes off into these little drives that curve off into individual neighborhoods that have character and their own trees, and each lot, has its own place. And you can see that there's a variety of size of the lots a little bit in these, not too much. But these are fairly common models of a lot of probably over 100 projects look sort of like this. And quite often, it's not the topography driving the configuration. It's the notion of embedding people so that when they're on a street, they don't see out and they don't see a long distance. Now, they would be invited to towns to do a park. And so, great, they'd arrive in town and they'd start working on the park, and then pretty soon all the people who had brought them to town were the movers and shakers, the government officials, the businessmen, the robber barons and all, and they would actually turn out, well, they had some land adjacent to that park, and there would be these developments, and so they got a lot of work with the park as the leading edge, and then the work would start flowing in to the office from that entree. And so here you see a road by John Charles Olmsted next to Cherokee Park in Louisville. Well, let's talk about John Charles Olmsted and the thing that's not talked about very often, and that is the business model. It's been said that Frederick Olmsted was hard-headed and was a wonderful administrator, and he was very good at logistics. But it's also been said that he was tough. I think he was tough. He worked with some very tough guys. And his son came into the office at age 20 and was there for 40 years, working very long and very hard, and did a lot. And of course, there were other partners. This is John Charles. He's a very talented man. I think he was born to it, and he had it in his fingers. He was a great draftsman. Some of his drawings have been misidentified as H.H. Richardson for a while. He was very good, but he also became a fairly astute businessman who was comfortable working with guys who ran steel mills and sort of logging operations and stuff like that. And the office grew because, you have 6 people, and then you get 2-minute jobs, and you need somebody else to help you with another job, so you hire some more people. But then, as that job's winding down, you need to pay the person if you don't want to let them go, so you need more work. So it's kind of a pyramid scheme. I don't want to say that, but our businesses, these are commercial enterprises, and the Olmsted office, as you heard, grew to about 30 by 1900. It's about 60 by 1928 or so. So they were busy, and they went all over. And John Charles really spent a lot of his life on the road. He was the guy he'd been out west as a kid. He came back to New York when he was 12 years old, so he kind of liked California and the West, and so he went out west. But he also was comfortable and did a lot of work with business. This is a steel mill in Pennsylvania, Vandergrift. It's one of many company towns that they did, and you'll notice that there's the factory, in this case the mill, and then there's the fairly conventional curving tree-lined streets, and then you'll notice also that there's lots of little lots, and then there's a few bigger lots, and then there's some parks, and there's the river is preserved. In doing these, the other thing was he was involved, did a lot of heavy lifting during the World's Fair in Chicago. There's no question that the whole office is all hands on deck to get that project done. And while Rick was young and in the barn with Burnham and some of the engineers and architects, kind of getting very comfortable and familiar with Beaux-Arts architects, John Charles was doing other stuff, getting it built. And because that fair was so successful, then of course we have the St. Louis Fair that Kessler did, and then along comes a series of fairs out west. The one in Portland, Oregon, I think was in 1905. The one in the Alaska-Yukon Exposition in Seattle, I think was like 1908. And so I have the right date, I think. Anyway, and what happens is John Charles does these. He's the guy who has to go out and get them done with some help. And he's there, he meets everybody, he gets some of the work that you saw that Mark showed us yesterday, and he also, and there's the mountain that we heard about, he reorganizes the fair. He had the plan, one kind of plan, and then when he went out and the fog lifted, he saw the mountain and he said, oh my God, I missed the point, and he turned the whole thing to face the mountain. And so he revised the design based on when the clouds lifted and he saw Mount Rainier. Well, the people out there liked him, he got along real well, and so he ended up, as you heard a few minutes ago from Charles, one of his great commissions out there was the Uplands project in British Columbia, out on the Vancouver Island, next to Victoria. This project was a rather remarkable project, I'd say, in that, as Charles just said, not only does it have all the different lots, you can see the complexity of the plan and how many lots. There's a very successful plan. It still is considered one of the nicest places to live in that region. But he also had this notion of preserving this meadowland. It was a kind of a savanna-like area that had been created by the Native Americans through burning and through their practices for wildlife management and for certain vegetation. And so Olmsted, John, J.C. says, don't touch this. So in the middle of this development, there is this commons that is really quite unique and very beautiful, and everybody loves it. This is still probably the prestige place to live if you live in Victoria, and it's the most expensive real estate there. If you go on Google and look it up, you can find out. Well, while out there, of course, he after the fair in Seattle, the exposition, he ended up doing a whole park system for the city. And that, of course, gets him to deal with all the people who own property and do that sort of stuff. And so he ends up being asked, and here we see his hand. He's a wonderful, I don't know of a landscape architect who could grade a road better, lay out the vertical and horizontal alignments of a road than John Charles Olmsted. And Dawson is good, and other people were good, but Percy Gallagher was good. But J.C. really had it in his fingers of how to do this stuff, and he was fast, and he would go out there and he'd spend a couple of days and really get a lot done. But and so there's the parkways with Lake Washington Boulevard. So, but one of the things he was asked to do while I was out there was a place called the Highlands, in north of Seattle. It's up in Edmonds, and it's still, if you go on the internet, you will find houses there for sale, and they are still extremely expensive. It was the second homeowner community built west of the Mississippi, I think, and there's an air photo of it today on the left, and you can see the road pattern. It looks just like those drawings we've been seeing, only now it's got all the trees and it's 100 years later, and you can see this. Doesn't that look like one of the roads on Mount Desert Island or something? That's a subdivision development road by John Charles Olmsted. So the ability to produce this natural seeming experience while in a dense subdivision was something that they really were masters at. This is a current air photo of it on the left. On the right, of course, that would lead, having done the plan for it for this organization, that would lead other people to step up and say, well, I'd like a house there. I want that site. I want that site. And so this is Bill Boeing's, this is the guy who founded Boeing Aircraft Company. This is his house. which was completed in 1912. And so you can see that he kind of, you know, I know you're interested in the native woods, but I kind of would really like some of that Eastern establishment stuff, and I want a lawn, and I want a view. And so there's this sort of mixture of types. You heard about Thornwood from Mark yesterday afternoon, and its focus on Mount Tacoma, well, Mount Rainier, Tahoma, whatever you call it. Again, it's a kind of imported architecture, rather like the building we're in to some degree, but it also has all these native plants and everything. And one of the things that's interesting is that J.C. writes in one of his letters to his wife, he's frustrated with the people in Seattle. He said, "What's wrong with these people? They don't understand how beautiful the vegetation is." And he mentions, he said, they don't realize how beautiful Salal and Oregon grape is, and he really wants to use the native palette because he finds it so interesting and lush. Anyway, so he has a very full career, but he dead at an early age. 1920, he's gone. But he has been the senior partner up until that point. He was the first president of the American Society of Landscape Architects. All the other landscape architects thought he was the cat's meow, especially after his father died. He was the most distinguished senior landscape architect in America until he died. Well, his younger brother, Rick, who was 18 years younger, which is quite a difference, different mother, different period. Both of the brothers, you have to, you know, I showed you transcendental paintings and that sort of stuff. These kids grew up in a very different world. They didn't go through the Civil War like their dad. They grew up in an era of absolute expansion, of wealth, of convenience, and of opportunity, and they had a very different life. And J.C., while he was working on the fair, met Burnham, met Ruitt, met all the Chicago architects, met McKim, etc. And there you have, by 1908, he's working on the Macmillan Commission plan for it's basically a development plan for Washington, D.C. It's not just the mall, it's the whole darn thing. It's got Rock Creek Park, it's got the stuff along the Potomac, the tidal basin, it's all there. Well, here's this young guy who has gone off to Europe with these old established architects who are all Beaux-Arts trained and everything. He's drunk different water than his dad has, and he's interested in and gets along with the East Coast guys, and he becomes a consummate planner and bureaucrat. He's also still a real designer, and he does have a good hand. He knows what he's doing. It's just he's very interested in the big picture, and he gets along so well that he starts the National Fine Arts Commission, creates the National Capital Planning Commission, writes the Organic Act for the National Park Service. He's really man in Washington, D.C., setting the profession in the right direction, trying to organize stuff, etc. And he then, when his brother dies, he has to really finally take charge of the whole firm and the whole country, and he has, by then, many partners, of course. So his early training, I'd say, at being a kind of clerk of the works and apprentice down at Biltmore, which was an interesting thing for him to have to do, is pretty green when he was there, and his letters are really kind of interesting. He's quite insecure at the time. But he also sees the big picture when he's down there. So he's gets the detail, he gets his hands dirty, he understands the whole operation, the logistics, and then he also gets this notion of thousands of acres and planning for resource management with people like Gifford Pinchot, who Olmsted had recruited to help with the project. So stepping back, at the time that J.C. is designing the only park the Olmsteds did in Philadelphia, the League Island Park, now FDR Park, they did nothing else there, but they did over 100 projects in the Delaware Valley and around Philadelphia. And most of them are all estate work. This happens to be Stoneleigh, just out in Villanova, just outside Philadelphia. It looks kind of like this place. It's the same era, and it's the same stuff. And they followed Ferruccio Vitale there, who had done a project that the owner didn't like, and so it was too stiff and too Beaux-Arts for him. So he brought Olmsted and not JC, he brought Rick, and Rick at this point gets Dawson to do the work. And Dawson ends up knowing all the people in Philadelphia and doing so much of the work in Philadelphia. This is Stoneleigh today. I would recommend you go see it. It's being managed by a National Lands Trust. It's a quite beautiful place, and they're naturalizing certain areas and conserving other areas and being quite loyal to the Olmsted vision, I would say. And it has the formula of so many of their estate projects, which I noticed here yesterday. And this is a drawing I did about 40 years ago when I was beginning teaching. I went out to Oaks Ames Estate in Easton, Massachusetts. And on the left, there's a plan, and on the right is a kind of funny aerial sketch I did of it. And what you see is this, it's a refuge and prospect, you might say, in that the house is embedded in a group of trees in the heart of the site. There's a perimeter boundary plantation. He dams up a creek, a very Reptonian, dams up a creek, and makes this long extended lake with a view to the sunset to the west, and then a view down a long meadow to the west also, these two divergent views. And then you'll notice the outbuildings. There's the H.H. Richardson famous gatehouse with all the boulders and everything that H.H. did, that you come in through the gatehouse, and there's this long drive, but the house is off view, and you come to it sideways up and to the little thing. And then all the other ornamental stuff, kitchen gardens, orchid houses, all that stuff is all enfilade along that drive. But the house itself, like Stoneleigh, like the place we're at right now, is in the heart of the property with these extended views and everything under control, but hugged by the trees. It's a really quite nice formula. But the work when they have smaller sites, only 50 acres and tinier, along in Fairmount Park or something near Fairmount Park in Philadelphia, like this is a house, this is Krisheim in Philadelphia. Drawing by Dawson and others, and a picture of it on completion in 1912. This is part of a very large body of work they did in the East of projects that have, shall I say, European, geometric, I'm trying to not use the word formal, John, but they have basically classically derived gardens that employ everything from arts and crafts stuff to Renaissance details in a kind of melange. And this is a building built by the Woodward Estate, and it's a quite beautiful building and house and garden, recently restored very handsomely, and featured in a magazine last year. I would say that there is an enormous body of work that they did that is like this project, and you see aspects of it around here. There's another thing, though, however, in Rick's career that we should pay attention to, and that is his development of the larger scale, his vision. Rick, at Harvard, when he was at Harvard and he started the landscape architecture department, urban design hatched out of landscape architecture, and so the first urban design program comes out of the landscape, and then planning gets hatched in landscape architecture at Harvard, and it goes off. And he basically starts an organization which is the beginning of APA, the American Planning Association. The first article he wrote for Landscape Journal was about traffic and intersections and roundabouts. If you really pay attention to Rick's career, he really is interested in infrastructure systems. And so here's a project he did. Everybody knows about Forest Hills. They think of it as a tennis center, which there is, and you can see it just in the background here, and there's Manhattan. But in Queens, he and Grosvenor Atterbury did a project for the Russell Sage Foundation. It's a 175-acre real estate development, a really remarkable piece of work. And it shows that their office by this time, they were collaborating with all the great architects in America, regionally, locally, and nationally, and they were working on an awful lot of development projects of one sort or another. Real estate development probably was the bulk of their income as an office. And somebody should do a study of them as a business, which I would like to have happen, because I have this feeling, I kind of feel it, but I don't have the facts, but you can see it in the work. It's a wonderful project. I hate using the word formula, but there is. The formula is tree-lined streets, trees, trees, trees. And also don't see out too far, only see so far, and then you change direction or go back or do something else. Houses separated from each other. The Riverside vocabulary is here. The houses are freestanding. I think it's a 175-acre real estate development. There's 800 single-family homes here. And now that is a suburban development, right? 800 single-family homes. And there it is, right in Queens. You can take the train, get off the train right there. You saw the station. These little cul-de-sacs, no through traffic. It's quite a remarkable project, and it's very beautiful, and its value holds up. It's still expensive. There's wait lists to get places. People read the obituaries to see if they, to jump on a property, So anyway, so here's the plan that Rick and his colleagues did for Baltimore that you saw earlier from Charles, and of course it's a traditional Olmsted big vision plan. Take all the drainage courses and wetlands, and we put those into preservation, and for a sponge to handle stormwater and that sort of thing, but also for wildlife conservation. And then you can put a parkway alongside one, and then and then there's some parks. And of course, Druid Hill Park had gotten started by other landscape architects. They didn't actually do that park. They did a later phase, but they did do a lot of development around it. And if you look at this, is Druid Hill's scheme in Atlanta. And in Atlanta, one of the things that they did was they did let's do this nice long parkway with these kind of wider greenswards and treed alleys and islands. But then they would do this hierarchy of streets. And the interesting thing, I blew up one piece of it so you could see it, where you see the diversity of lots. And this is John Charles' hand at work here. You can see this beautiful, and here he really did master the topography quite beautifully. And one of the things is the lots range from about 1.5 acres up to about 8 acres in this one section. So there's quite a diversity of orientation and of privacy. So, and the privacy on each site is a very interesting aspect of this development, which I thought was, when I went to see it, I couldn't find all the slides I took when I was in Louisville at that conference, I lost every one of them. I don't know where they are. Anyway, but it's beautiful. Go see it. Well, California. You've heard about California yesterday from Christine O'Hara and a little bit from Charles this morning. One of the things is that the first big project that Rick does out there is Rick does a plan. He does a report which becomes a plan for a state park system for California in 1928, which is kind of amazing, the whole state, and they did it. That's the thing that's so wonderful. They have probably the best state park system in the nation because of it. I love their state parks. I mean, it's hard to, you can name one after another, and they're wonderful parks. By 1928, he's also invited with Edward Bennett to do a plan for the city of Los Angeles. This starts out to be a parks and recreation plan, but that's it. Landscape architects know that when you do a parks and recreation plan, you're really doing a development plan. That's what you're doing. You lay out the structure. And so he was very interested in the highway systems, which he proposed, and their report, which University of California Press has a reprint of. It's quite an interesting book. But it shows the freeways and the hierarchy of streets and all that sort of thing. But unfortunate timing, they finished it at the end of 1929. And so it came out, they published it in 1930, but the real estate market had crashed. Everything was, the local moguls didn't want to have anything to do with it, and nobody had any money anyway. So it died. But something else happened, and that was his brother had started working earlier here at Palo Alto. And so Rick picks up the pieces at Rancho Palos Verdes. And with Dawson again, and some others, they begin to go back to work on this. And so in the 1926, 27 or so, about 6 years after JC's death, we find Rick at work on Palos Verdes, and we find the work that you saw yesterday. And here you see one of the early roads. It's quite beautiful, isn't it? Nobody's there. It's just a few people out there on this fabulous. But look at how big it is. I can't remember, you heard it yesterday, how many thousand acres it was, but it's a remarkable project of all sorts. But it was a vast Spanish territory, ranch that this one developer you heard about from New England, from New York, goes out and with others proceeds to hire Olmsteds, and they begin early and they keep working there right through the 30s and 40s. And laying out thousands of lots. These are photos off the internet of marketing places today that are at Ranchos Palos Verdes. You can find out a lot about Ranchos Palos Verdes. There's 4 or 5 golf courses. There's all sorts of things. There's the schools. But it's still very much what they had in mind. There is a drawing from the J.C. and Dawson days, one of the early phases. That's one of the first phases. And you can see the beautiful road layout and how it has, at its heart, it's got some community parks. It's going to have some little commercial centers. It's going to have some special places. And then it's going to have miles of drives and lots that can be laid out. And of course, you go there today and it's quite extraordinary. It's really wonderful. So I guess I threw away I better find that because I'm breathless. I just hate to run over. So I guess one of the things to say is that, no, this is not the right page either. Oh, well. Trying not to bore you. Oh, well. It was oh, well, it doesn't matter. I can tell you what I was going to say. I think, in fact, I should give, I didn't take all those pictures and I didn't do all those drawings. There's a lot of people involved. One of the things to say about the Olmsted firm, and that is that they did a lot of work, a lot of different stuff, but they also were a business and an enterprise and the father's vision is translated and to the sons about the devices of but I'm not sure that the existential spiritual vision totally came through by the end of the firm. I think there's a watering down that happens, and it's not that they're never hacks. They did the best stuff that anybody did, and their work holds up very well across the country, among the very best. But the fascination with the suburb is something that Olmsted really helped lead the vision of the suburb as a good solution to what you don't like about cities. And I think there is this double-edged sword of producing beautiful places, but also, we can't blame the Olmsteds for all the terrible development that's happened in the last 50 years, any more than we can blame Frank Lloyd Wright for all the bad tract houses. Something with big plate glass windows and in a carport. You can't blame on Neutra, but I think the truth is that a lot of the fascination that there's a legitimization of suburbs in the Olmsted career that I think we need to actually take carefully and evaluate in terms of the net result and how to now respond to that. And I don't want to take anything away because the dad was a genius, the kids were amazing in many different ways that I'm impressed by and favor. But I think we need to really understand their broader idea about the firm as it existed for 100 years. I guess I should then say, thank you. There is a tradition of questions and of people asking difficult ones, so go ahead. All right, there's one over here.
Laurie, do you think that, is there a relationship between the internal combustion engine and the despiriting of the suburb? I mean, think about Forest Hills, it's still reachable by mass transit, by rail, and it's
That's part of what's right about it. It's not auto-dependent, although when you get there, you're out in the sticks or you're in the wilds of Queens, but you can walk to stores, you can walk to schools, you can do stuff. So the notion that the early suburbs, and I showed you two of them in the South, that they were rail accessible, and they were designed before the motor car, and so therefore not everybody. You notice they didn't have stables on all those sites. There were not those were not horse ranch places. But his belief that the worker should not be tied to the family, shouldn't be tied to the city, and should be away from it in a rural setting, I think Olmsted Sr. believed was important, and I think his sons bought that. But they started practice just as Henry Ford and John D. Rockefeller kind of killed the electric car industry. They basically began their practice at a point when the romance with the automobile hit America, and so I think that has as much to do with it as any possible single factor. Because yes, the early projects all were rail dependent. Good point. Thank you. I should put that into the next version if I do this ever again. Hi. Hold it. I think they want you to have a mic because they're trying to record. It's only not because they think I'm too deaf, which I am, but they want the recording to get your question.
Are there any Olmsted developments that are now not desirable places to live? Because you always describe these places as like people want to move to them. Or is this just their effect translates into...
Are they all a success and did nothing fail?
Correct.
I don't know the answer to that, but I doubt there are any. Arlene, do you know of any that are struggling? I don't think so.
And I really think that you also, there's a whole level of around the war
Right.
time villages
Yeah.
and what they do for the munitions industry and then
Right. Sure.
developments. And these, we look at them and they're much smaller lots of
But they're pretty nice still. Yeah, they're like close-in, tighter communities. I think partly because they originally were grabbing good pieces of land. Is partly they're good pieces of land, and they would be sort of upwind of industry or wherever they were developing them, or they're adjacent to big parks. So I think most of them, in terms of the issues of equity and gentrification, one can raise real questions about, or not questions, just say, well, that's what the result was. It may have been partly, I don't know that it was the purpose always, but it was certainly a result, and it still is, yeah. They were not Levittown, yeah. Let's have another question. Hi, Charles. Did you let him get your question?
I'm going to stay clear of the equity question right now. And I was, in seeing Druid Hills, I found myself thinking about the individual planting plans that were done for each of those sites. And then thinking about, for example, Kylie getting paid, $5 a pop for the Holland Hills little plans.
Yeah, right.
And I was curious, we know in the early work, Warren Manning was in the office overseeing planting, and you showed a lot of, early 20th century projects. And I was curious, in looking at this work, the idea of how the landscape was treated in terms of plant materials, if you found any kind of interesting patterns or...
Let me say a few things about that. By the way, a few years ago at Berkeley, I gave a talk at a conference on the aesthetics of planting. That essay's in the little book of essays that I have out. By the way, everybody who's talking, not everybody, but many people talk here, have books out there. Buy them, our publishers think nothing is moving, But one of the things I was going to say, in that essay on the aesthetics of planting, I talk at some length about Olmsted's ideas about planting specifically, and his negative attitude toward horticultural excess and toward exotic plants, and his interest in native plants, and I pull from different periods in his life, from his Yosemite days and from later when he's doing other things, and then I showed them plans of Jackson Park after the fair by J.C. Olmsted. There's really lush plans. And if you look at the photographs of, say, Prospect Park or something, these people are, wandering through mounds of azaleas and of ericaceous shrubs and stuff like that. So Dad knew a lot about native plants. He actually was, he was I'd say a semi-expert in orchards, and especially certain fruit trees, corresponded with downing at some length on horticulture. And one of the things their plans quite often did, and I didn't talk about it at Stoneleigh, and I implied it with the Columbia School of the Deaf and Dumb, but this notion that, and you can see it here sort of, quite often in a plan there would be a background of some sort that would, like Patricia showed us yesterday, and then Olmsted Sr. used the word capes. He talked about capes, and which he meant like these promontories that would come out of vegetation, making these coves, these bays. And he'd make the capes by pulling some big specimen trees out with some understory trees and some shrubs to make these sub-rooms. And the sub-rooms would be very floriferous, quite often with native material. And then he would talk about the layers of the native material. John Charles clearly got that, understood it, loved it, and was able to do that almost in his sleep. He really had the feel for the plants. And he'd studied, you know, at, where did he study? Bussey School? No, Sheffield. Yeah, well, the two sons were both sent to the Rocky Mountains when they were young to do surveying with the Coast and Geodetic people, U.S. Geological Survey. Then they both were, you know, sent off to college to get the education Dad didn't get. And they both studied, one studied at the Bussey School, the other studied at the Sheffield School for biology and geology and science and engineering. So they were well trained. And in terms of plants, they really are horticulturally very rich and diverse, but not in terms of botanic garden. They kind of not, you know, the idea of naming things and having them one of this and one of that was not their idea. They loved drifts of things. Does that answer your question? Yeah, okay. They were plantsmen, and they hired people who really knew plants. I mean, going all the way back to Ignaz Pilat and the people at Central Park, he always liked to have people around who knew more about things than him. So that's what rule one of a good administrator is: hire people smarter than you are, know more than you do. Anything else, or shall we? No. Hi, here's a question.
Yeah, do you think that developers and landscape architects still design with the idea of the prospect, or that the view of nature is what's best for the people that are living in the community?
I think we do when we can, yeah. I think it's a habit of mind that we, and it's not just Americans like views, but, you know, the Japanese and Chinese do too, but they have less room quite often, and so they do smaller and contained views. But the notion of producing imageable prospects is something that is still haunts the field. It won't go away. I mean, we do love beautiful things, but as John said in his talk, and others, I think, Vitold and Patricia, everybody who really studies landscape architecture knows that yes, we deal in imagery, but you have to move through it. And unlike other art mediums, the moving through it means you really have to design it in all kinds of ways. I've said to people, you know, we're like music, you know, that you can't see it all at once, you can't hear it all at once, you have to remember it and keep it in your head. But unlike music, you have to be able to play it backwards. And that's one of the things about that defies the proscenium view of just the picture, is the fact that you got to play it in different directions. And I think the time is up, and the people are saying, so thank you again.